My guardians told me they couldn't afford a family trip. Then I found out they flew first class without me. I stayed quiet until my aunt smirked and said, "Maybe next time you should work harder." 5 days later, they weren't laughing anymore. I, 22 thought I understood betrayal until I discovered my guardians' first-class boarding passes tucked between the pages of a travel magazine they'd left on the kitchen counter. The leather seats, the champagne service, the exotic destination I'd begged them to take me to for graduation, all of it captured in glossy photographs that made my stomach turn. 3 months earlier, I'd approached them about a family trip to celebrate finishing college. I'd worked part-time throughout my studies, saved every penny I could, and even offered to contribute half my savings toward the cost. My guardian sat me down with that familiar look of patient disappointment, explaining how tight money was this year. His wife nodded sympathetically, adding that maybe we could do something local instead, a camping trip, perhaps, or a weekend at a nearby lake. I accepted it. I'd been living with them since I was 14, after my parents died in a car accident, and I knew they'd made sacrifices for me. They'd taken me in when my aunt, my father's sister, had made it clear that her own family came first. So I swallowed my disappointment and threw myself into job hunting instead. The boarding passes were dated for the exact week I'd suggested for our trip. First class to Bora Bora, the same resort I'd shown them in the brochure, the same dates I'd circled on the calendar. But there were only 2 tickets. I sat in their kitchen, staring at those boarding passes until my hands shook. 8 years of being told we couldn't afford new clothes. 8 years of watching them take separate vacations while I stayed home. 8 years of believing their explanations about money being tight. The numbers didn't lie. First-class tickets to Bora Bora cost more than my entire college tuition. When they returned from their trip, tanned and relaxed, I watched them unpack luxury souvenirs while they told me about their business conference. My guardian's wife showed me photos on her phone, carefully angled to avoid showing the resort's name. She talked about the networking opportunities, the important contacts they'd made, the deals that would help our family's financial situation. I played along. I asked about the weather, admired their tans, and listened to their stories about the local culture. Inside, something was crystallizing, not just hurt, but a cold, calculated understanding of exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of priorities. The breaking point came at a family barbecue 2 weeks later. My aunt was there with her husband and their 2 kids, along with several other relatives. I'd just started my new job as a junior analyst at a consulting firm, and the conversation naturally turned to my future plans. My aunt's husband mentioned how expensive travel had become and how they were saving up for a European vacation for their family. My guardian agreed, shaking his head about the cost of international travel these days. He mentioned how they'd had to pass on several opportunities because of the expense. I watched him lie with practiced ease, his wife nodding in agreement. Several relatives expressed sympathy about their financial constraints, praising them for their sacrifice in raising me. The conversation shifted to me, and my aunt asked about my plans for the future. I mentioned wanting to travel eventually, maybe take a proper vacation once I'd established myself in my career. My aunt's expression shifted, that familiar look of condescension I remembered from childhood visits. She told me that maybe I should work harder if I wanted nice things. Her voice carried that particular tone of superiority that had always made family gatherings uncomfortable. She continued, explaining how some people expected things to be handed to them, while others understood the value of hard work and sacrifice. The irony was suffocating. Here was my aunt, who'd refused to take me in after my parents died, lecturing me about work ethic while my guardians, who'd just returned from a first-class vacation they'd lied about, nodded in agreement. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, forcing my expression back to neutral. The plan that had been forming in my mind since I'd found those boarding passes suddenly crystallized into something concrete. That night, I began my research. My job in consulting had taught me how to dig into financial records, how to trace money flows, and how to build comprehensive profiles of individuals and companies. I started with public records, then moved to social media analysis, and finally to financial databases that my company had access to. What I discovered was stunning. My guardians weren't just comfortable financially, they were wealthy. Their business had been thriving for years, with multiple income streams and substantial investments. The life insurance payout from my parents' deaths had been managed by them as my trustees, and while they'd used it appropriately for my education and basic needs, they'd also invested the remainder in ways that had benefited their own portfolio. Everything was legal, technically. They'd fulfilled their legal obligations as my guardians. But the moral picture was different. They'd raised me in deliberate financial constraint while living luxuriously themselves, all while accepting praise from our extended family for their sacrifice. I spent 3 weeks building my case. I documented their travel patterns, their purchases, their investments. I traced their social media presence, their business partnerships, their real estate holdings. I wasn't looking for illegal activity. I was building a complete picture of their deception. The genius of my plan was its simplicity. I wouldn't confront them directly, wouldn't make accusations, wouldn't give them a chance to craft explanations or defenses. Instead, I would let the truth reveal itself naturally, in front of the people whose opinions they valued most. My guardian's wife was particularly active on social media, constantly posting about their activities and purchases. She'd been careful to avoid posting anything from their Bora Bora trip, but she hadn't been careful enough. I'd found tagged photos from other travelers, location data from her fitness app, and credit card receipts from resort purchases that had been automatically shared to a family expense tracking app. I created a comprehensive digital portfolio of their deception. Screenshots, receipts, travel records, social media posts showing their lifestyle versus their claims of financial hardship. I organized it chronologically, showing the pattern of lies and the specific timeline of their Bora Bora trip versus their claims about being unable to afford family travel. The delivery method was crucial. I couldn't just send this information randomly. It needed to have impact, to reach the people whose opinions mattered to them. My aunt's comment about working harder had given me the perfect opportunity. I waited until the next family gathering, a birthday party for my cousin. I arrived early and helped set up, making sure to be present for all the preparation conversations. I listened as my aunt and my guardians discussed their upcoming vacation plans, with my guardians again lamenting how expensive travel had become. When the party was in full swing, I mentioned that I'd been thinking about my aunt's advice about working harder. I told the gathered family that I'd been doing some research into financial planning and investment strategies, trying to understand how successful people manage their money. I pulled out my tablet and began sharing some of the financial literacy resources I'd been studying. I talked about the importance of tracking expenses, understanding investment returns, and being honest about financial priorities. Several relatives gathered around, interested in the discussion. Then I mentioned how inspiring it was to see examples of people who'd built wealth through smart financial decisions. I started showing examples of luxury travel, high-end purchases, and successful investments. I talked about how these things were possible when people were strategic about their money management. The photos I was scrolling through weren't random examples. They were carefully selected screenshots from my guardian's social media and purchase history. My aunt was the first to notice, pointing out that one of the resort photos looked familiar. I acted surprised, then looked more closely at the image. I mentioned that it did look like the resort from my guardian's wife's fitness app, where she'd been tracking her beach walks. I pulled up the app on my tablet, showing the detailed location data from their Bora Bora trip. The silence that followed was deafening. My guardian's wife began to stammer out explanations about the business conference, but I was already scrolling through more evidence. The first-class boarding passes, the luxury hotel receipts, the expensive restaurant bills, all of it displayed in chronological order. I maintained my innocent tone, asking questions about how they'd managed to afford such luxurious accommodations during their financial difficulties. I wondered aloud if perhaps I'd misunderstood their situation, if maybe they'd found some new income source that could help with family expenses. My aunt's expression had shifted from smugness to shock to something approaching horror. She asked pointed questions about the timing of the trip, the cost of the accommodations, the contradiction between their claims of financial hardship and their obvious wealth. Other family members began to chime in, remembering conversations about money troubles, about sacrifices made for my benefit, about their inability to afford family activities. The evidence on my tablet painted a clear picture of systematic deception. My guardian finally found his voice, trying to explain about business expenses and tax deductions, but his arguments fell apart under scrutiny. The personal nature of the purchases, the luxury accommodations, the timing during what was supposed to be a family vacation, none of it supported his claims. The conversation grew heated. Family members who'd praised my guardians for their sacrifice began to express concern about the deception. My aunt, who'd been so quick to lecture me about work ethic, was now demanding explanations about financial priorities and family values. I watched it all unfold with careful neutrality, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never making accusations. I let the evidence speak for itself, let the family draw their own conclusions about the pattern of lies and the systematic exclusion of me from their real lifestyle. The party ended early, with most family members leaving in uncomfortable silence. My guardians barely spoke to me during the cleanup, their earlier explanations having crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. Update 1. The aftermath began the next morning. My phone buzzed with messages from various family members, some expressing shock, others asking for more details about what they'd seen. My aunt, who'd been so quick to dismiss me the night before, sent a particularly long text apologizing for her comments, and expressing concern about the situation. My guardians called a family meeting for that evening. They sat me down in their living room, the same room where they'd explained years ago that we couldn't afford family trips. Their tone was different now, less parental, more defensive. My guardian's wife began by explaining that they'd never intended to deceive anyone. She talked about their business expenses, their need to maintain professional appearances, their responsibility to network and build relationships that would benefit the family long-term. My guardian added that they'd always provided for my needs, that I'd never lacked for anything essential. He pointed out that they'd funded my education, provided housing and food, and supported my career development. He suggested that I was being ungrateful, that I was focusing on luxury travel instead of appreciating their sacrifices. I listened to their explanations with the same careful neutrality I'd maintained at the party. When they finished, I asked simple questions about their reasoning. Why had they lied about the business conference? Why had they claimed financial hardship while living luxuriously? Why had they excluded me from their real lifestyle while accepting praise for their sacrifice? Their answers revealed the depth of their deception. They'd created separate financial worlds, one for family consumption, where money was tight and sacrifices were necessary, and another for their actual lifestyle, where first-class travel and luxury purchases were routine. The conversation continued for hours, with my guardians alternating between defensive explanations and attempts at emotional manipulation. They talked about their legal obligations, their financial responsibilities, their need to maintain their business reputation. They suggested that I was being selfish, that I was attacking them unfairly, that I was destroying family relationships over material concerns. I remained calm throughout, asking for clarification when their explanations contradicted the evidence, pointing out inconsistencies in their reasoning, but never raising my voice or making accusations. I let them reveal themselves through their own words. The meeting ended with them asking what I wanted from them. I told them I wanted honesty about their financial situation, transparency about their lifestyle choices, and an end to the deception that had defined our relationship for years. They agreed to be more open going forward, but their tone suggested they still didn't fully understand the scope of their betrayal. They seemed to view it as a misunderstanding about money rather than a fundamental breach of trust. Update 2. The real consequences began to unfold over the following weeks. Word of the confrontation spread through our extended family network, and the response was more severe than I'd anticipated. My aunt, who'd been so quick to lecture me about work ethic, became one of the most vocal critics of my guardian's deception. She reached out to other family members, sharing details about the evidence I presented and raising questions about the pattern of lies. Her husband, who worked in finance, began asking pointed questions about the management of my parents' life insurance money and the investment decisions that had been made on my behalf. My guardians found themselves facing scrutiny from multiple directions. Family members who'd previously admired their sacrifice began to question their motives. Business associates who'd been told about their financial constraints began to notice the contradictions in their lifestyle. The social media evidence proved particularly damaging. My guardian's wife had been so careful to craft an image of modest living for family consumption while documenting their luxury lifestyle for their social circle. Once family members began looking at her posts with new awareness, the pattern of deception became impossible to ignore. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed narrative crumbled. Family barbecues became tense affairs, with relatives asking uncomfortable questions about their financial choices. Their business reputation began to suffer as the story of their deception spread through professional networks. My guardian called me several times during this period, his tone shifting from defensive to desperate. He asked me to clarify the situation with family members, to explain that there had been misunderstandings, to help repair the damage to their reputation. I told him that I'd simply shared factual information about their financial situation and their travel patterns. I hadn't made accusations or demanded explanations. I'd just provided transparency about their lifestyle choices. If family members were drawing negative conclusions, that was based on their own interpretation of the evidence. His frustration was obvious, but he couldn't argue with my reasoning. I'd done exactly what he'd always taught me to do. I'd been honest, transparent, and factual. The consequences were simply the natural result of their own choices becoming public knowledge. The most satisfying moment came when my aunt called to apologize personally. She admitted that her comment about working harder had been inappropriate and unfair. She explained that she'd been influenced by my guardian's claims about their financial situation and hadn't realized the full scope of their deception. She asked if there was anything she could do to make amends, any way she could help repair the damage that had been done. I told her that the best thing she could do was to be honest with family members about what she'd learned, to help ensure that everyone understood the true situation. Update 3. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. My guardians had become social pariahs within our family circle, their reputation permanently damaged by the revelation of their systematic deception. Business relationships had suffered, family gatherings had become uncomfortable, and their carefully constructed image of sacrifice and hardship had been replaced by a reputation for dishonesty and selfishness. I'd moved out of their house shortly after the confrontation, using my savings to secure my own apartment. The independence felt incredible after years of manufactured financial dependence. I could make my own choices about spending, travel, and lifestyle without navigating their elaborate deceptions. My career was flourishing, partly because I no longer felt the psychological burden of their financial manipulation. I'd booked my own vacation to Bora Bora, staying at the same resort they'd visited, but paying for it with my own money and sharing the experience honestly with family and friends. The most profound change was in my relationship with extended family. Relatives who'd previously viewed me as a charity case began to treat me as an equal. My aunt, in particular, had become a strong advocate, frequently checking in on my well-being and inviting me to family events that my guardians now avoided. My guardians made several attempts to reconcile during this period. They offered explanations, apologies, and even financial compensation for the years of deception. They suggested family therapy, mediation, and various forms of compromise that would restore their reputation while addressing my concerns. I listened to their proposals with the same careful neutrality I'd maintained throughout the process. I told them that I appreciated their willingness to make amends, but that trust, once broken so systematically, couldn't be restored through financial gestures or therapeutic interventions. The final conversation came on the anniversary of my parents' death. My guardians asked to meet with me, hoping that the emotional significance of the date would create an opportunity for reconciliation. They brought photo albums from my childhood, reminders of the good times we'd shared, evidence of their care and sacrifice during my formative years. I acknowledged their positive contributions to my life, their role in my education and development, their legal fulfillment of their obligations as my guardians. But I also pointed out that their deception had been equally systematic, that their lies had been as consistent as their care, and that their recent behavior showed no real understanding of the trust they'd broken. They asked what they could do to earn my forgiveness. I told them that forgiveness wasn't something that could be earned through gestures or promises. It was something that happened naturally when people demonstrated genuine change over time. Their patterns of behavior suggested that they viewed the situation as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be repaired. They wanted to restore their reputation, to return to family gatherings, to resume their previous lifestyle without the burden of social consequences. I wanted something different. I wanted them to understand that their deception had been wrong, that their financial manipulation had been harmful, that their systematic lies had damaged not just our relationship, but their own integrity. The meeting ended with them asking if I would ever be willing to rebuild our relationship. I told them that I remained open to honest communication, but that any future relationship would need to be based on transparency and mutual respect rather than the power dynamics that had defined our previous interactions. A year later, I received a wedding invitation from my cousin. The return address showed that my guardians had moved to a different state, apparently seeking a fresh start away from the social consequences of their deception. The invitation included a note explaining that they declined to attend the wedding, citing scheduling conflicts. I attended the wedding and enjoyed reconnecting with family members I hadn't seen in months. My aunt made a point of introducing me to her friends, talking about my career success and my independence. Several relatives commented on how well I was doing, how mature I'd become, how proud my parents would have been. The conversation inevitably turned to my guardian's absence. Family members expressed mixed feelings about their departure, relief that family gatherings would be less tense, but also sadness about the permanent damage to family relationships. I listened to the discussions with the same careful neutrality I'd maintained throughout the process. I didn't express satisfaction about their social exile, but I also didn't express regret about the consequences of their choices. I'd simply provided transparency about their behavior, and the family had drawn their own conclusions about the implications. The wedding was beautiful, and I found myself thinking about the nature of family relationships, the importance of honesty, and the long-term consequences of deception. My guardians had taught me many valuable lessons during my formative years, but perhaps the most important lesson had been unintentional. They'd shown me exactly what kind of person I didn't want to become. As I watched my cousin exchange vows with his partner, promising honesty, transparency, and mutual support, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The boarding passes I'd found in that travel magazine had revealed more than just a lie about a vacation. They'd exposed a fundamental dishonesty that had shaped years of our relationship. The revenge I'd sought hadn't been about punishment or retribution. It had been about truth, about transparency, about ensuring that their deception had consequences. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about their suffering. It was about my freedom, my independence, and my ability to build relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. 5 days after my aunt's smirk and her lecture about working harder, my guardian's world had indeed begun to crumble. But the real victory wasn't their downfall. It was my liberation from their web of lies and my emergence as someone who valued truth over convenience, honesty over harmony, and integrity over acceptance. The story had started with betrayal and ended with independence. The boy who'd been excluded from his guardian's first-class lifestyle had become a man who could afford his own first-class tickets and, more importantly, who understood the true cost of deception in human relationships.